This is really about who is still engaging with Iran commercially to give it revenue. And really what that means is one person, one country, and that's China. China is the major buyer of Iranian oil. And if the Trump administration really wants to get at Iran and build economic pressure on them, they're going to have to cut that channel.
US Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent unveiled what the Trump administration is calling the toughest sanctions in history against Iran.
We are launching an economic onslaught against Iran's financial connections around the globe. Our objective is to sever every economic lifeline that sustains this tyrannical regime until Tehran stands alone.
So pretty strong words there. Bessent said that the measures will target countries, banks and companies that are still trading with Tehran as Washington seeks to force an endgame to the 6-month conflict. And this announcement comes as Iran and the US are still not in any meaningful talks to actually end the war, which continues to threaten oil supplies and shipping through the Strait of Hormuz. So to discuss all this, we're going to go to Emily Kilcrease, who is a former Deputy Assistant US Trade Representative and is the Director of the Energy, Economics and Security Programme at the Centre for a New American Security, or CNAS, as I used to know it. Emily, what exactly is Scott Bessent actually threatening here? I mean, how far could these sanctions go? Because we've heard from the Trump administration before, there's a lot of bluster, there's a lot of scary words and big threats. How much leverage do they have here? How far are they willing to go?
That's a really important question. There is a pretty big disconnect potentially between the very strong words we heard from Secretary Bessent, economic D-Day, crippling Iran's economy, and what was actually announced. What was announced was an important, what I would characterize as kind of daily routine sort of enforcement package against Iran. Keep in mind, the United States has had massive sanctions on Iran for over a decade. We've had some form of sanctions on Iran since 1979. This is not a new economic warfare front for the United States or for Iran. And so the amount of economic pressure that the U.S. can still bring to bear is pretty marginal. So what we saw today was enforcement, and some good enforcement, which is necessary to keep economic pressure up. And we saw some veiled threats. And this is really about who is still engaging with Iran commercially to give it revenue. And really what that means is one person, one country, and that's China. China is the major buyer of Iranian oil. And if the Trump administration really wants to get at Iran and build economic pressure on them, they're going to have to cut that channel. That brings up all sorts of different complications, including how this fits into the broader U.S.-China relationship right now, whether the Trump administration is willing to sanction Chinese banks, for example, that are still facilitating these sorts of transactions. So we heard some big words today, but still a lot of open questions about what exactly is going to happen in the China relationship.
And realistically, Emily, to be blunt, why would China back down here? America has ended up in an absolute morass in Iran of its own making. It's actually, I mean, I don't think it's too strong to say that it's in some ways being humiliated by Tehran over the Straits of Hormuz, a problem that almost everyone could have potentially envisaged that would arise after striking Iran. So what incentives does China have to do anything other than let this play out?
Well, you're certainly right that in some ways this plays into China's hands, right? It does not make the United States look good. It is depleting munitions at a very worrisome rate. But on the other hand, China does have a strong interest in this conflict coming to an end. They also need energy coming out of the strait. They can get the sanctioned energy, they can get the illicit energy flows, but it's far better for them if you actually have the shipping returned to as close to as normal as it can. And so for that reason, they do want the conflict to come to an end. Now, that is a slightly different question than are they going to cooperate with the Trump administration to cut the illicit energy trade off today. And that gets into questions around China's own energy demand and how willing they are to go along with the U.S. sanctions approach. Keep in mind, the U.S. already did sanction a Chinese refinery earlier in this conflict because of these exact same issues. And China's response at that point was actually to issue a counter-sanction, basically forbidding its companies from complying with U.S. sanctions. It was the first time China had ever done that. So I think you can expect a fair amount of resistance from China to any sort of U.S. overtures to align with their sanctions approach here.
And if you're the Iranians, which you're not, but if you put yourself in their shoes, does this worry you, these kinds of sanctions? Or as you say, are you really quite used to this sort of thing from America? And actually, if your goal is survival and the endurance of the regime, but also using this leverage that you've gained over the Strait of Hormuz to get a better deal with yourself with America, you're not really likely to look at hear this very pungent rhetoric from Scott Bessent and think, oh, okay, well, actually, now we should probably buckle.
Right. Yeah, no, there's a couple of important points in there. One, Iran has been under heavy sanctions for a while. They've gotten quite good at evasion and, getting around sanctions, whether it's financial channels, whether it's the illicit shipping channels. They know how to survive under sanctions. And in particular, the regime knows how to survive under sanctions. The Iranian population is certainly suffering, but there's a question about how much pressure that actually puts on the Iranian regime itself. So even if this were more significant economic pressure, you have to answer that ultimate question of, is it kind of having the political higher level effect that you want it to have on the Iranian regime's decision making? And from what we've seen so far, the package today that was announced really is not going to move the needle on that front. Iran has survived. It will continue to survive. And let's keep in mind where this all started. This operation started with the U.S. and Israeli military decapitating the Iranian regime. This is existential for them. So it's going to take a lot more than just kind of a good enforcement package of sanctions to convince them that they're really under an economic crisis that they can't get out of. And again, it all comes back to China as the major oil purchaser, because that's really the only thing that would have that sort of needle moving effect at this point.
So, Emily, Scott Bessent and the American government, it can't really bully China. China's too big to bully. It can't bully the bond markets. We've had Scott Bessent trying to announcing huge US government buybacks of its own treasury bonds, but I don't quite see how that's going to necessarily cower the bond markets. But one person it potentially can bully is the Canadians. And we've got this kind of trade war developing with America's northern neighbour, and it's actually getting quite heated and quite serious. So I wonder if you might just sort of tell us where things are with Canada and where it might go. It's not there's a sort of almost comic aspect to the US fighting with Canada, because it's like their neighbours, they're they're such close countries in many ways. They have this huge economic partnership, but yet here we are, and Mark Carney's not backing down.
Yeah, I think Mark Carney would certainly say that he can't be bullied at this point. But you're right, it is heating up. Keep in mind, Canada has been bearing the brunt of kind of really abnormal U.S. tariffs since the start of the the second Trump administration. They got hit with fentanyl tariffs very early on in the administration, even though there's basically no fentanyl that comes from Canada to the United States. They have just had a very, very difficult position with this Trump administration the second time around. And unlike most other countries, they've decided to retaliate. They've decided to take a stand. And part of this is because of the political opinion in Canada, which is very anti-US at this point. There really is not political support in Canada for Mark Carney to take a more accommodating position. And so where that leads us to is that the two sides they had a month-long period where they were trying to resolve some differences, trying to resolve the latest U.S. tariff threats. They engaged in very substantial negotiations and even got to a point where they were agreeing to reduce some important tariffs in the auto sector. But when it came down to it, it sounds like the U.S. was pushing for some issues that really touched on Canadian sovereignty in a way that just was not going to be politically feasible for Mark Carney to agree to. Things like, the U.S. Saying that Canada would have to impose certain tariffs just because the United States said that they should on countries like China. That's just not something that is politically workable for Canada to agree to at this point. So where we are now is that we are certainly in an escalatory cycle. The only potential good news is that both sides have announced retaliatory tariffs with a slight delay. So that does leave some additional time for negotiation. So hopefully cooler heads prevail. But if not, and it doesn't look great at this point, candidly, we could see some real economic harm come from this latest round.
Yeah, and the economic harm will, I guess, fall more heavily on Canada than the US, but it will affect both. And it does seem to me that in a world where America is taking on its enemies, whether it's Iran or China or its adversaries, shall we say, it might want to sort of get on slightly better with its friends. But anyway, thank you very, very much for joining us. That was Emily Kilcrease, who is the Deputy Assistant US Trade Representative and is now a director at the Center for New American Security.